Wonderful. Well, we've got time for some questions. There are 2 microphones here. Feel free to get in line. If you would just say your first name and where you're from. And if you'd also mention if you've ever been here before, I would just love to know that. In fact, by the way, let me just ask, how many people have never been to this event before? Oh, that is fantastic. And therefore, I guess the rest of you have been. And now you're thinking, oh, I thought it was a different Joel that was coming, Joel Osteen, or I don't know. But anyway, you're very kind, very, very kind to come back. The rest of you didn't know what you were going to get. So anyway, but thank you. Okay, let's start here, and we'll go back and forth, and keep your questions concise, if you would.
Okay, I'm Ken from Lakewood. I have 2 questions. If there is no sacrifices, what is covering the sins of the Jews now? And the other question is, what do the Jews believe comes after this life?
Yeah, great question. So the first one is, there's nothing covering the sins of anybody, but particularly the Jewish people, if there's no temple sacrifice. That's the problem. Leviticus tells us very specifically that without blood sacrifice, there is no forgiveness of sins. It's repeated in the New Testament, but that's the problem. What's interesting is that Daniel, the prophet Daniel, tells us in Daniel chapter 9 that the Messiah will come. He doesn't identify who it will be, but he will come, he will bring atonement, then he will be cut off, it says. Really, we know that's combined. Then it says the Jerusalem and the sanctuary, the temple, will be destroyed. Well, back in the time of Daniel, nobody understood that. In 70 AD, we understood it perfectly. That Jesus came, and after bringing atonement on the cross and his resurrection, only after that was Jerusalem sacked and destroyed by the Romans and the temple destroyed. Therefore, God not only brought the Messiah and his atonement first to institute the new covenant, but he did it about 40 years before the destruction of the temple. But this is the problem that my team has. The Jewish people do not see this. We don't understand that Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecies, and therefore we're trusting in other things. We've come up with other theologies that will help us say, well, at least if we pray on Yom Kippur, we're good for that year. But that's not actually what the Hebrew scriptures say. It says, without blood, there is no sacrifice. Therefore, that's why we need the new covenant. Your second question is, what do they believe about the afterlife? Well, there's 14.5 million Jewish people in the world, roughly, and I would say there's probably 14.5 million different views. So I mean, they're really, what the Bible says is there's heaven and there's hell, and you have to choose. But, being Jewish is, in the modern Jewish world, it's just kind of make it up as I go. It feels like, because, you can be a Jew-boo. There are Jewish Buddhists, right? There are Jewish Hindus. There are Jewish agnostics. There are Jewish atheists. There Jewish almost everything. But if you are Jewish and you want to believe in Jesus, ooga, ooga, then everybody goes to DEFCON 1, like button up the mountain, ooga, ooga. Like, oh, we can't. There was actually, a few years back, there was in Commentary magazine, which is a Jewish journal, a thought journal, there was a symposium, and they had dozens of really famous and really smart Jewish intellectuals and religious leaders writing, American Jews, writing what does it mean to be Jewish? And they all had essays in this whole, in this particular magazine. The only thing they could agree on, of all these Jews, what does it mean to be Jewish, is that, well, Jews don't believe in Jesus. That's the only thing they agreed on. Everything else was sort of up for grabs. There were some who don't even believe in God. There were some who don't believe that God is the God of the Bible. So that's a challenge. And so if you ask, what do you believe about the afterlife? Well, you would have to believe what the God of the Jews believe, what he tells us. Otherwise, how would we know? We only know from the Bible. And if you reject the Bible, it's tough to understand what the consequences are of rejecting the Bible and rejecting the very Messiah that God sent. I will add one last thing. Moses told us back in Deuteronomy, there will be a prophet who comes, and he will come from our people, from the Jewish people, and he will be, he basically says he'll be greater than me, and when he comes, if you don't follow him, you'll be cut off from your people. Moses tells us that if you don't believe in the Messiah, you got big, big troubles. And yet, that's why we have to bring the good news to our people. Whether they believe it or not, that's their call. But they need to hear it, right? And we need to share it. So let's go over here. Thanks for the questions.
I'm Bill. We attend Mile High Calvary, which is a church plant from the church here.
Oh, great.
And I've listened to you every time you've been here.
Thank you.
Putin, he claims to be a Christian. Comments?
Well, Jesus told us that you can't really judge a man what's in his heart, but you can judge the fruit. The fruit of a murderous dictator doesn't suggest a born-again experience. So we can pray for him. People also ask me, well, the prophecies of Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38:39, that Russia will form an alliance with Iran and Turkey and other countries in the last days and come and surround Israel. And people ask me, is Vladimir Putin Gog? Is he the evil dictator that's described? I said, wait, it's a little early. We don't have enough data to draw that conclusion. Now, is he Gog-esque? Yes, I would say that he is Gog-esque. Could it prove that he turns out to be? It could, but there's no reason to jump ahead. He's bad enough in his own right. But I would note to you, though, this very week, on the eve of Yom Kippur, where did Vladimir Putin go? He went to Ankara, that's the capital of Turkey, and there was a headline. I just realized I left my phone with my son, but otherwise I read it to you. But essentially, the headline said, and I posted it on my blog this week, it said, Putin heads to Ankara to forge alliance between Russia, Turkey, and Iran. Now, I didn't write that, except in a novel, The Ezekiel Option, and in a nonfiction book, Epicenter. And I said it would happen because that's what the scriptures say. Is that fulfillment of prophecy? It's a little early, but it's just interesting on the eve of Passover, with all these other things going on in the world, that you get a headline. And where was that headline? It was in Al Arabiya. That's an Arab newspaper from the satellite TV company from the Gulf, saying, interesting, Putin's forming an alliance between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Now, it didn't mention anything about the prophecies because they don't know anything about the prophecies, but we know about the prophecies, and as I tweeted out, for students of these prophecies, it's curious, it's interesting. So pray for Putin and his family. That would be a big miracle. But God saved Nebuchadnezzar, and he saved Manasseh, he saved me, so anything's possible. Okay.
My name's Randy. I'm from Aurora. We go to Fellowship Community Church, and it's the first time that we've been here with my family. And
well, welcome.
This is a great place, great church. So thanks for hosting this. And
thank you to the pastor, Gino Geraci, and your team for hosting us. Thank you very much. Amen.
So thank you very much for being here. My family and I, we kind of follow you and always inspire what you write and say, and so appreciate your interweaveness into politics and important people. My question is that as someone, hey, I live in Aurora, I go to work, I go home, depending on which TV I watch is the opinion that I get of what's going on in the world. There's people like you that are well connected, of course, with Mike Pence, the head of the CIA, that you're friends with them. For the past 8 years, personally, I felt that maybe the current administration or that administration didn't really understand the apocalyptic part of it, or as far as jihad goes. So I was worried, I was concerned. Now there's a change in administration. My question is to you, do you feel better about that they understand what's going on in the world more and have an intent to do something about it?
That's a great question. So knowing, as I put my cards on the table, my reservations during the campaign about whom to choose, in terms of the cabinet and the national security team, it's pretty impressive. These are solid experienced people. And I am encouraged, even if I didn't know a number of them, I am encouraged by knowing their background, knowing what I know that they know, the things that they've said, their experience is actually very impressive, and it's heartening. It would be more heartening if you had either an experienced commander-in-chief who knew how to absorb that information and how to execute a strategy, or at least one that didn't worry us every few days about things that really have nothing to do with national security, but raise questions of judgment. But anyway, that's the president. So I would prefer a president who is struggling but has a great team around them to a president who doesn't think he's struggling and has a lousy team around him. So, that's where we are. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Hi, Joel. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you to Len and Mary Jo for your devotion to the missions field. Living with snakes is not something I would want to do, even though I have a heart for the lost.
They didn't even tell you some of the really good stories, eating eyeball soup or all. They've had a lot of interesting stories over their years.
Well, I'm Michelle Morin. I'm from Colorado Springs.
Great.
I have a radio show on Sunday nights, and you have graciously agreed to join me tomorrow night.
I'm looking forward to that tomorrow.
I have about 50 questions, so I'll try to narrow it down to a couple. Some of the questions I already asked, or some I wanted to. Like you, I have a passion and a calling to be a watchwoman on the wall. I don't even hold a candle to your expertise, and I just drink up everything you say, and your books are definitely Pringle Chips chapters. About Putin, my dad flew in Vietnam, and I have a friend who escaped Vietnam, and they both have told me, once a communist, always a communist. And on my show and in my public speaking, I try to point to Putin and show the guy is a serious threat. And I get blank stares, lack of interest, and some conservatives even actually try to say, oh no, he's really not as bad as he seems. He takes care of his people, his country. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that. And I'm also very curious, you keep me tempered about Muslims. It's very easy to go overboard and generalize all of them. And you're saying there are about 10% that really are a threat, which is, in numbers, it's huge. But what interests me a lot more is you once, in one of the books I have, you said that because we can't get in there and evangelize them, they're actually hearing the gospel via dreams and visions. And I'm just curious what more you can share about that. That
Okay.
fascinates me.
Sure.
And,
Well, if you could ask, questions that were shorter for answering, because those are two big questions. So, all right, the first thing on Putin, I don't have a lot to add on that because we've covered a lot of it, but I think I am concerned also that I am getting a lot of blank stares, and I think you're wrong on that. And this is from conservative leaders, evangelical leaders as well, but mostly conservative Republican leaders. Look, I actually commissioned a poll earlier this year. We were getting ready for the release of Without Warning, and I was mostly polling to find out what were Americans' views about whether we were winning the war against ISIS or not, and most thought we were not, or at least the plurality thought that we were not. But I added a question because I knew I was heading down the road of writing the Kremlin Conspiracy, and I was just curious, and we added a question in. Do you basically consider Vladimir Putin and his government in Russia a clear and present danger to the national security of the United States, Israel, and our allies? Now, that number came in at 70%. 70%, 7 out of 10 Americans. You can't get agreement out of 7 out of 10 on almost anything in this divided, red, white, polarized universe that we're in right now. So that tells me that at the gut level, people get it. They see Putin and they are worried. Right? However, I think within the thought leader community, again, I think it's that. I think it's that people have been so focused, center-right, on radical Islam and trying to get people to understand it, why that's important, why we have to deal with it. You had a previous president who said, that's not even the issue. We're talking about violent extremists. They wouldn't even define it. I think we got ourselves so myopically focused on an important mission, which is to educate and mobilize people to understand why that's a threat, radical Islam and apocalyptic Islam, that we sort of forgot people in North Korea or in Moscow that are also a serious threat. And why is Putin ultimately more of a threat? Because he actually has nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. You know, we're worried about North Korea because they're developing them. We're worried about Iran because they may develop them. Russia already has them, which is why he invades Georgia and nobody does anything, because they say, well, you can't go to war with, what are you going to do? Go to war with Russia? They've got nuclear weapons. Then he invades Crimea. They say, well, what are you going to do? Go to war with Russia? They've got nuclear weapons. Then he invades Eastern Europe, or Eastern Ukraine, and you say, well, what are you going to do? Go to war with them over Ukraine? He's got nuclear weapons. He invades, essentially, Syria, and he's creating a stronghold in Syria with Iran. What are you going to do? Go again? You know, so because he has nuclear weapons, it doesn't mean he'll necessarily use them, though that's also horrible, but it's that he has the trump card, as it were. So the answer to the question ultimately is, the only way to stop him is to stop him before he does it. You have to have deterrence that is so strong he won't move. Because once he moves, you really do have to ask, am I going to nuclear war with Putin? The second question is a longer one, and it's a wonderful one, about dreams and visions in the Middle East. It's not one I have time to get into tonight, though I love that topic. We will be having, so our ministry is called the Joshua Fund, and we're going to be having an Epicenter conference next week in Southern California. And so I would commend you, if you could come to California. We'd love to see you in Orange County. But if you can't, we'll also have all the things eventually posted online. The reason I say that is because the topic of the Epicenter conference for this year is, what does the future hold for Israel and her neighbors? And we're going to be talking about how is God advancing the gospel in Israel and in the Muslim world. And so we will be talking about these issues in more detail. We will not be talking about the geopolitics of the Middle East. We will be talking about the prophecies, what's coming, what do we know that the Bible says is coming in that region of the Middle East, what I call the epicenter, and then what is God doing? And we're going to have Israeli Jewish pastors and Palestinian Arab pastors with us. So I commend that to you as an opportunity to kind of get a more in-depth understanding of what God is doing to advance the kingdom. And it's not just miraculous stuff. It's satellite television, it's radio, it's internet. God's doing a lot so that Muslims, at least, and Jews have a chance to hear the truth and make a decision. That's important. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for the questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mike. My wife's Tara. We're from Naples, Florida. You've spoken at our church a couple of times, and we sure enjoy you.
Wow, thank you. Thanks for coming all this way.
Well, we didn't come for this, but we're here.
Nevertheless.
You kind of already touched on this, but I felt like you were just very brief in your initial conversation on Putin and Russia. You know, Islam, they will die for their cause because they're defending their God. Putin says he's a Christian. He's not a Christian, clearly. So he's not going to die for his God. He's not going to die for his cause. I guess my core question is, why is Putin more dangerous than the Islam? Why is that movement more dangerous than the Islamic movement?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, look, actually this ties in a little bit to the setup for the previous question. You know, one's a communist, always a communist, I guess. But, you know, Putin was raised, you know, he joined the Communist Party when he joined the KGB, and of course being in the Russian military before that. But I don't think of him as a communist. I don't think communism, I don't think Marxist Leninism is what's driving Putin. I think he was trained in the Soviet system, so he gets that. But I don't think at his heart he's an ideologue in terms of communism. Nor do I believe he's a fascist, a Hitler type. I believe he's a czar at his heart. I believe he's a Russian nationalist who is humiliated by the fact that the Soviet Union imploded. That's what he told us. He told us in a speech, I think in 2005, that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, if you think through the evils of the 20th century, I don't know, the Holocaust comes to mind. Stalin, who killed 20 million people, that comes to mind. Pol Pot in Cambodia, murdering 3 million people, that comes to mind. World War I, World War II, these all outrank what I believe was one of the best things that happened in the 20th century, which was the collapse of the Soviet Union, the liberation of the Russian people and all the other peoples, the Estonians and the Ukrainians and the Latvians and all the rest of them who were under Soviet slavery. But that's his mindset. He's humiliated by that. And what does he want? He wants to draw all these forces either back physically under his control or effectively under his control by blackmail and coercion. He's a czar in his heart. And czars are imperialists, and imperialists want to expand. And he's having he actually claimed the Arctic for himself, the North Pole, recently, a couple years ago. Okay, now he has trouble expanding eastward because China's a nuclear power. He historically has had trouble moving westward because of NATO, but now he keeps nibbling westward and nobody's doing anything. So I think that he is a czar who thinks it's all mine anyway and I'm going to get it. But his Soviet training as a KGB agent and a Cold War mindset causes him to think if I have an action, there will be a reaction. The problem is there is no reaction except huffing and puffing at the UN, press releases and some sanctions. So he does all these things and he thinks nobody's doing anything. So I think his hunger is growing to do more. And I think that's what's motivating him. And I think so that plus the possibility that there could be a miscalculation and we actually could get in a war with Russia. Like, for example, if he were to invade Latvia, Estonia, or Lithuania, those are small countries. Most of you, honestly, couldn't find it on a map immediately. It's just not part of, we don't think about these little countries, but they are NATO countries as of 2004. Now, there's a Rand Corporation study that showed last year that he could grab those countries in 60 hours because these countries have so little defense and NATO has done so little to help them. Now, there's been a little bit more over the last year since that report came out, but if Russia were to actually grab one of those countries, that's an Article 5 trigger of NATO. That means one nation is attacked in NATO, we're all under attack, we go to war. Do you think America's going to go to war for Latvia? Estonia? We have a problem because if he grabs it, I'm not sure that we have the desire to honor our promise. But if we don't, that's the end of NATO. There is no NATO. Now we don't have collective defense. Now he is the king of the mountain. He can take over any country. He can affect any policy because nobody's going to stop him. That's existential. Because if you go to war with him, you are fighting a nuclear power. If you don't go to war with him, you may end up being under the blackmail of a horrible, horrible thug. And that's, when you add those pieces up, you realize that a bombing in Brussels or Orlando, a shooting in Orlando, while that's bad, this takes it way, way up. That's the threat. That's the danger. I think here. Yeah. I'll try to give shorter answers, but you guys are asking really good questions.
I'm Randy Nelson from Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I know you're not here because of me, but I appreciate you.
Actually,
coming.
that's
Anyway.
true, but I just discovered this seminar this morning and
wonderful.
signed up.
Welcome.
My question is, do you have any comment about the war that Psalm 83 seems to describe?
No.
I can accept that.
The only reason I say that is because, without going into the whole details of Psalm 83, it's an interesting passage, but there's a question whether it actually is a prophecy or if it's a heart cry from that time. It's clearly that, but it is also a prophecy. Now, there have been a number of Bible teachers who have been convinced and are making the case that it is an eschatological prophecy, that there is a whole series of wars that will be fought around Israel, and that more and more enemies of Israel will be defeated, and that would be a good thing. I mean, enemies being defeated, not that we want war. But I don't find myself convinced. I'm not saying that it's necessarily wrong, that analysis, but I don't see it. It doesn't have the classic eschatological language. It doesn't say, in that day, or in the last days. Thus saith the Lord, these things will happen. It's a prayer, it's a cry, oh Lord, deal with all these threats against us, which has been pretty much the prayer of every Jew throughout history. So it doesn't make me say, okay, that's definitely something that I need to put in the eschatological trajectory of events. So that's my short answer. Thank you. Yes.
My name's Becky, and I first heard about this conference on the Ross Kaminsky show, and very much
I
appreciate
love doing his show,
what you did
and
there.
I've never met him before, but I really enjoyed that. So I'm so glad that you came because of that,
Well,
and weren't driven off because of what I said.
Well, I attend a local church, so I'm very
Okay.
glad to hear from you.
Thank you.
My question is, okay, I don't have your connections. I like being informed. I like primary sources.
Yes.
I like context to be truthful. If you were in my situation, how would you go about getting your news? And what resources can I look at that maybe I wouldn't know about?
Yes. Well, first I would subscribe to my blog, which is free. I believe in free as much as possible, although I know we ask you for money tonight. So every time I do analysis, whether it's a Jerusalem Post column, Fox News column, what have you, or just for the blog, I do links to all my sources. So I am really trying to let you go, okay, so you say, but where are you getting this stuff from? I also try hard not to, I won't link to what I think are questionable sources, even if they're accurate in that particular case. If they look and feel like, I don't know, I won't link there. Now you might say, well, you link to the New York Times, you link to CNN, so hello. My answer to that is, if you want to do fake news, become a novelist. There's a job that's called fake news. It's what I do, but I own it anyway. So right, I get it that the mainstream media isn't always. But my point is, if you're a skeptic, and I'm not sure that you are, but let's say you are, you're listening to me and you're like, okay, whatever. If I quote from Al Arabiya and link to that, and I said that's their headline, I find significance in it because of looking at it from a biblical lens. But anyway, that's what they're saying, or that's what the New York Times is saying, then I think that's more helpful. You can also, follow through Facebook and Twitter, and I'm retweeting constantly stories that I find interesting, things that I'm tracking. So, yeah, I can't vouch for 100% accuracy on all of them, but they're worth paying attention to. So now also, if you go to my website, joelrosenberg.com, if you go to the About Joel section, I do have links to books that I have found helpful resources, and in the months ahead, I'll actually be posting more. But anyway, those are some ways to, at least track what I find credible. I'm not saying that's the only pool to draw from or to jump in, but I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Sure.
My name is Mike from Lincoln, Nebraska.
Hey, Mike.
We did come to hear you speak.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind.
And to learn about ministry architecture.
Oh, good.
But my question has to do with the relationship between the United States and Israel.
Yes.
I've noticed over many different years that presidential candidates often promise to move the embassy, the U.S. Embassy, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Yes.
But when they become presidents, they don't do it.
Right.
So my question is, what's your take on the importance of moving the embassy to Jerusalem?
That's a great question, Mike. I appreciate it. So I think it should be moved. Look, given the relationship between the United States and Israel, that it's one of, if not the closest alliances of all 192 countries that we even are aware of, much less the countries that we're close to, the idea that we won't recognize formally at least the Jewish side of Jerusalem as the actual formal capital that won't ever be given up is striking. It's wrong, it's actually immoral. And it's sending a terrible message to the Palestinians and others that maybe West Jerusalem actually is up for grabs. It isn't. Now, and what's interesting about that, and I live in Jerusalem now. We've just moved from the coast up to Jerusalem. And so it's an interesting place. I mean, when we first moved to Israel, and we were trying to discuss where we were going to live, and we were praying about it, and my wife wanted to live in Haifa, because that sort of has the beauty of sort of San Francisco and rolling hills and on the water, and it is lovely. I wanted to live in Jerusalem because I wrote a book called Epicenter, and that is the epicenter of all human society and God's plan and purpose. And my kids wanted to live by the beach so they could surf. So, that's what we did. And but now we've moved to Jerusalem. So what's interesting is in Jerusalem there are not just one, but two official U.S. government facilities that deal with Palestinian Arabs. Two. And not one building in Jerusalem that is the official representative of the United States government to the state of Israel. It's wrong. It's actually a big mistake. In this case, I think the president has it right that he should move it, and he plans to move it. I will say that him coming in and him being who he is, I actually am encouraged, though, that he's taking a little time to think it through. This is not something we are seeing in every area of his policymaking, okay? And it's commendable. This is going to have an effect on our Arab allies. They're not happy about it. I think they will live. But I think it's important to sit down with the King of Jordan and get his take and consider all the ramifications of the relationship between us and Jordan, because that's important. I think it's important to sit down with President El-Sisi of Egypt, who's a key strategic ally, and get his take, as well as others. And I think by taking some time, this shows us something about the president that we're not seeing in other areas, and therefore it's commendable and it should be encouraged. In the end, this ought to be the administration that moves it. And honestly, there is a consulate in West Jerusalem. All you have to actually physically do is remove the nameplate with a screwdriver that says consulate and put one on that says embassy, and you're done. Now, it doesn't mean over time you might not build a larger facility, but you can use the Tel Aviv facility for a lot of the administrative work, but put the ambassador in that building and be done with it already. It's not up for grabs. Okay, thank you. Yes?
Hello, Joel.
So I just want to make it clear. So it's 9:17. We're going to go to 9:30, and then I'm going to close in prayer, and then we're going to go to Q&A. No, we're going to go to book signing. We are in Q&A. Yes. Okay.
I wanted to revisit your comment about 90% of Muslims are not radical.
Yes.
Through my viewpoint, I don't see that they really have an effect. Is the radical element driving that religion?
Yeah, well, that's the problem. But that's true of any radical force. In other words, the 90 million people that live in Iran are not apocalyptic Muslims. They're not trying to bring about genocide. They do not want nuclear weapons. They don't want to bring about the end of the world as we know it. The supreme leader wants to do that, and his clique. So what is that? 15 people, 50, 1,000? It's not 90 million. But when you have the gun in your hand, you're in charge. So it doesn't matter if the whole room is peaceful. If the terrorist has the gun, everybody does what the terrorist wants or the leader wants. And this is the problem. Now, the good news is there are moderate Muslims. I understand that people want to say, they really want to mock this idea Islam is the religion of peace and to get into a whole thing. Look, we can get into a whole thing, theologically, all Muslims need Jesus as a savior, not just a prophet, okay? But I'm glad that 90% of Muslims do not want to kill me. That's good, and it should be encouraged from a foreign policy perspective. I have had the opportunity, to write in my novels a range of characters, good, bad, ugly, right? Radical Islamist terrorists and moderate Muslims who really want to make peace and who want to fight the terrorists. One of them, as you may know, in my most recent series, was King Abdullah II, the King of Jordan. I actually named him as a character in the series. Now, that's risky, right? When you're Jewish, and you're an evangelical, and you're a Zionist, and a U.S. Israeli citizen, it's not exactly the greatest idea, the most obvious idea in the world, to make a Muslim monarch a character in your book if the enemies in your book are trying to assassinate that particular king and overthrow his kingdom, right? That could be a problem. We could have been banned from that kingdom forever and ever and made him mad. But he read the books, and he liked the books. And he invited my wife and me to come and spend 5 days getting to know him and his team because he could see we actually like Jordan. We don't want it to be overthrown by ISIS. That tells me that, first of all, it's kind of fun that these books kind of go everywhere and even a king would read them. He had read the second one, actually, The First Hostage, and I brought him copies of the first book in the series, which is called The Third Target. Now, if you're not familiar with them, you're like, the first book is called The Third, and the second book's called The First. Okay, anyway, it is, yes. Well, I gave him a copy of The Third Target, and I said, Your Majesty, I just, thank you so much for inviting us, and I brought you this because I know you only read the second book in the series. Can I just show you the first line of the first page in the series, which says, I had never met a king before. And he laughed, and he pulled out a pen, and he goes, well, you have now. And he handed it back. Now, it's not normal for a Jewish evangelical U.S. Israeli citizen to sit with a Muslim monarch. He is actually a direct descendant of Muhammad. He's the 43rd generation direct descendant. His family ruled Mecca and Medina for 900 years. Now, this man's a moderate, a peacemaker. Not only does he have a peace treaty with Israel and maintains it, but that he would invite someone like me? I'm not saying, I don't want to make it too big of a deal, but I'm just saying that's a personal observation. And so we have to understand that there are moderates and draw attention to them and affirm them, encourage them. This goes back to the other point. The President of the United States should be building a relationship with the King of Jordan. The man has a peace treaty. He's a former head of special forces in Jordan. He's actually fighting ISIS. We want to work with men like that, leaders like that. President El-Sisi, I had a chance to meet him in Washington in April. He invited me to bring a delegation of evangelical Christian leaders to Egypt to spend time with him, to get to know him, and so that he could get to know our point of view. And so, Lord willing, we will do that. This is just an interesting moment, and we have to be clear in our language, especially those of us that are evangelicals, that are followers of Jesus. To love our neighbor, it's not loving to them to lump them all together as wild, crazy fanatics who, if they really were reading the Quran, would kill all of us. We can have a theological discussion, but we want leaders like the King of Jordan and the President of Egypt to work with us to fight bad guys and create peace, and may their tribe increase. So I could go on, but I'll stop there. I hope that's helpful. Thank you. Okay, I'm basically going to be able to take maybe one more of each, and I think we're going to run out. I know there's you guys are asking good questions. You can stay up there for a moment, and we'll see what we do. But maybe I can go more rapid fire if you ask very simple, easy questions, which I doubt. But anyway, go ahead.
Patrick from Denver. You basically, since we got a czar in Russia, can you speak more about the freedom of religion? As I understand it, Russia's pretty free to be a Christian there. You're pretty free to bring in the Bible and so forth. Can you speak more about the threat and what is going on in Russia now?
2 words,
as far as freedom
not
of religion?
anymore. Not anymore. Putin has, under Putin, and just in the last year, he has restricted Christians, you can't invite someone to church anymore. You can't share the gospel with someone anymore. You can't give someone a Bible anymore. You can't hold your own Bible study in your house without government permission anymore. Now, how fiercely and firmly they will enforce that new law remains to be seen, but it has sent a chilling shockwave through the believing community that if you're not part of the official state Russian Orthodox Church, if you're an evangelical, you're under notice that you can't operate the way you did. In the privacy of your own church, among people who are already followers of Jesus, fine. But you can't express your religion beyond that in the way that we ought to be able to. And that means persecution is coming, because the church can't stop, especially now, preaching the gospel to a nation that needs it. So this is very, very dangerous. Yes?
Hi, my name is Cindy Ham from Batesville, Indiana, and that's not too far from where Mike Pence's home is.
Welcome.
And I flew in to ask you these two questions.
Okay, well.
First one's an opinion, and the other one's a little bit political, but the first one is, since you're in Jerusalem, and recently there's been some talk about the possibility that the Temple Mount is actually not where it is right now, or where we think it is, but it actually would be in the city of David. Do you have any feeling about the credibility? Okay.
No.
Okay, that was
no,
easy.
No, David lived in the city of David, obviously,
right.
And he bought the threshing floor outside the city of David, which is Mount Moriah, and that is where the temple. The archaeological evidence is solid. That spot is exactly where the first two temples stood. That's where now the Islamic sites, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are. But somehow, the scriptures indicate there will be a third temple, and ultimately there will be a fourth temple on that spot. There is no doubt about it.
Okay, great. The other thing is, can you address with the latest blog entry you had about Erdogan and Putin and Iran thinking about having an alliance of some kind, a treaty of some kind? How can you address how that is going to complicate our NATO alliance with Turkey itself?
Yeah.
And
oh, good. So you asked a simple one. So yes, this is a huge problem. Turkey is a NATO ally. So why are they buying advanced weapon systems from Russia? Why are they forming an alliance with Russia and Iran? If they're a NATO ally, why do they see value in that? And the reason is because they have been a faithful ally, and now under Recep Erdogan, they are moving to the dark side. So Turkey was the seat of the caliphate. For more than 400 years, the Islamic kingdom of the Middle East was centered in Istanbul, not Constantinople. Well, it's the same thing, but anyway. But when the Turkish Ottoman Empire fell in World War I, Kemal Ataturk decided to create a modern, open, friendly Turkish nation and align it more closely with the West. And that's what he did. And Turkey, for the last 80-some years, has been a model of moderate Sunni Islam. They're not Arabs, they're Turkish. I mean, that's an ethnicity, but they've been moderate Muslims. But Erdogan is a radical Islamist. He came in as a moderate. If anyone knew he was an Islamist, meaning he wants a political version of Sharia law and radical, Islamic thinking, then nobody would have let him become the president. But he came in and he's fired or arrested all the generals that might stop him, and he seems to have megalomaniacal designs. He seems to be creating himself into a sultan, and he's aligning himself with all the wrong players. And I think NATO has to have a serious conversation amongst themselves to say, is such a nation one that we intend to keep on the team? I don't think a nation has ever been kicked out of NATO that I can think of, but Erdogan is creating himself to be a candidate for that. Okay, I think this is the last question. Sorry, guys. I'm so grateful for all of your interest. We'll go with you.
So Joel, thanks for being here today. David from Denver. I love your parents' heart for bringing the gospel to the least of these through missions, and for your heart to bring the gospel to God's chosen people of Israel.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
I just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about you talked about the identity of some of the different end times nations, specifically Russia, Turkey, Iran. In Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation 13, there's 4 beasts. The 4th beast is terrifying and exceedingly strong, has 10 horns, then a little horn. Do you have any thoughts on who that might be?
Fortunately, no. Look, that is a question I can't answer in a minute. But this issue of, so Daniel does lay out these kingdoms, and he does it several different times in several different ways. And so we know the first one was Babylon, and we know the second one was Media-Persian because it's identified as such, and we know it historically. We know the next one was Greece, and it's identified in Daniel as such, and sure proved out to be. In fact, Daniel was so precise in these prophecies that many liberal theologians for centuries said, well, Daniel didn't write that back then. It must have been written by somebody else afterwards because it's so precise it couldn't possibly be true. Right, that's because it's supernatural, right? Daniel didn't understand it. God did, and God told him, and exactly what happened. And Daniel also told us the Messiah would come, and he did. And Daniel told us the Messiah would come before the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed, and who knew? Jesus came, was crucified, buried, resurrected before 70 AD. So Daniel is pretty impressive. But the 4th, so one way that he describes the 4th one is Rome. We know that Rome becomes the 4th empire. But we also know that the next kingdom is Jesus' kingdom. That's the messianic kingdom where he conquers the bad guys, as it were, and establishes not a caliphate, but the kingdom of Messiah Jesus from Jerusalem, a literal kingdom on earth. And so the question becomes, well, if Rome is the last one before the Jesus kingdom, but what about Revelation? What about the kingdom of the Antichrist? This is part, and we can't take the accordion and expand it right now just because of time. But this is why we believe that a revived Roman Empire, an empire based out of Europe, and possibly literally out of Rome, but certainly European, will emerge in the last days, essentially picking up the story where the original Roman Empire left off. And this is what the Antichrist will sort of emerge out of this system and then take over every system until he's conquered by Christ. What's interesting is there has been so much speculation throughout the ages, who's the Antichrist? And everybody's got some nutty idea. They're all nutty. You can't know before the rapture. After the rapture, it will be revealed. That's what Paul tells us in his letter to the Thessalonians. He says it multiple times. He will be revealed, this son of perdition, this man of perdition. But what's interesting is Daniel calls him a little horn, meaning one of the reasons we can't know who he is ahead of time before he emerges is because he has to be revealed as such, but also because he is considered not that significant, even at the beginning of the end, right? He's a little horn. He's not that big a deal. He's a little cheese. He's not the big cheese. He becomes the big cheese. He kills everybody else, and he pulls together through persuasion and deception this leadership in Europe, and then expands it globally. So any effort to try to identify the Antichrist prematurely runs into the fact that if he's little, well, then he's not going to look big. I mean, that seems obvious, but to all the nut jobs out there that are trying to, explain how they know, it's all nonsense. And so we'll wrap up on this thought, because there's so much teaching about prophecy that is just insane. Like as though all these people build their websites in Roswell, New Mexico. I mean, God bless the people of Roswell. I mean, but I'm just saying, like, woo, I mean, these websites where, everything's black and red with flames, and every sentence, every descriptor is in capital letters, and, with 1,000 exclamation points after every sentence, and you're like, hey, dude, have some decaf. I mean, it's, really, whoa. And, you had this thing with Fox News reported last week how the Christian numerologists were saying that September 23rd was the end of the world. First of all, there is no such thing as a Christian numerologist. And talk about fake news. I mean, come on, Fox. I mean, this is ridiculous. Second of all, what day is it? Have we passed the 23rd? Are we all still here? I actually have a collection of these types of books that these nut jobs have written, and I keep it in a box called Heresy. So I don't want it to be, on my shelf, and people like, when the rapture happens, they take over my house, and they're like, oh, so these are the books that you're supposed to read. No. But I have these books. There's one called the 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming in 1988. There were millions of copies. I used to talk about it, and someone actually brought me their copy. So I have one now. And I have the sequel, which is called the 89 Reasons Why Jesus is Actually Coming in 1989. The guy was a lunatic. And we just have to call out lunatics. Jesus said no one knows the date or the hour. What, but that guy? Oh, it's September 23rd. Oh, yeah, really? So this is one of the things that Satan uses to discredit actual sound, healthy teaching of Bible prophecy. And unfortunately, a lot of pastors and ministry leaders avoid teaching prophecy because they don't want to be lumped in with the lunatics. And my answer is, there's a lot of people who teach the gospel wrongly and bizarrely also, but that shouldn't stop us from preaching the gospel just because there are people on television who say, you have to give me all your money first, and then you might get saved. I mean, that's wrong, but we don't stop preaching the gospel because of people like that. Nor should we stop teaching the whole counsel of Scripture, including the 27% that's prophecy, just because there are lunatics. We teach it in a healthy, respectful way, and we let people draw their own conclusions. But if you're a watchman on the wall, if you're an ambassador, our responsibility is to teach everything from Genesis to Revelation, including the things about what God says will happen in the future. Because that's important to him, it's important to us. And if we don't do it, if we don't warn people what's coming, geopolitically and spiritually, eternally, those things will all still happen, but we will be held to account. And so our responsibility is to be faithful watchmen and reliable ambassadors, and to do our part to take the gospel to every nation, to every person, so that they have a chance to hear and understand in their own heart language and make their own decision. That's our mission, and we will be held to account by our Savior when time wraps up. Our time has wrapped up. Thank you for investing your evening, for investing financially. God bless you.